Hello and welcome from Television Studio 28 here at Voice of America in Washington. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, more than 100 million people around the world have been forced to escape from their homes, and that number is only growing. With this in mind, about 3 years ago, VOA launched a two-pronged effort to tell new stories of displacement to our global audience, and to do a better job of serving audiences who have fled their homes. My name is Gary Butterworth, and I've been leading this initiative. And I think we've had some real successes on both of these fronts. And today, we're going to focus on the second part of that, reaching and engaging refugee and displaced. And to do that, we have a diverse panel of communications professionals who have some real expertise. But before we get to them, I'm sitting here in one of Voice of America's television studios, but we're not on television. I'm clearly not a TV. So what's the session all about? Well, it's part of VOA's anniversary year, and we have Voice of America director Yolanda Lopez with us. Tell us more about that. Yolanda?
Thank you, Gary. One of the most important things about Voice of America is that for 80 years we have been constantly evolving. By some measures, we are the world's largest media organization. Every week, we reach an audience of more than 300 million people in 48 languages in nearly 100 countries. We are pretty big. We are fully funded by the US government, but we have journalistic independence built into our structure that allows us to broadcast objective news, as well as music, documentaries, and educational content to audiences outside of the United States, mostly in countries that either don't have a free press or where domestic press is still finding its footing. And we have been doing this since World War II. When our 80th anniversary rolled around last February, our public relations team and I got together and thought a good way to mark the occasion will be to convene a series of panel discussions so that we could reach out to interested parties beyond our traditional media audience. We wanted to share with them the types of conversations that our colleagues sometimes have among themselves. As Gary mentioned, reaching and engaging displaced audiences is something we've been paying increased attention to in recent years as the number of displaced persons has grown. VOA is the only major news organization broadcasting in the Rohingya language. We have installed new FM radio transmitters in 2 refugee camps in Kenya to ensure that refugees can receive our radio programming. And a program that we run in Bangladesh to teach English in a refugee camp was recognized by the UN Refugee Agency as a good practice according to the Global Compact on Refugees. The types of environments that lack a free press are also the types of environment that people tend to flee. So we have decades of experience in reaching who have left their homes. But we are working extra hard these days to improve our content for displaced communities. We have learned a lot, but there is always much more to learn. So I hope that today's discussion provides a platform for our journalists, other media organizations, the international community, and refugees themselves to share their perspectives on reaching and engaging refugee and displaced communities. Thank you so much. Back to you, Gary.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Now, let's meet our panel. Bilin Manyang was born in Kenya's Kakuma refugee camp. Parents who fled what is now South Sudan in the early 1990s. Hear a little bit of an echo there. Let's see if we can get that. Apologies to the audience. I know our technical team is working hard on that. As I was saying, Bilin Manyang was born in Kenya's Kakuma refugee camp. Parents who fled what is now South Sudan in the early 1990s. As an aspiring young journalist and fashion model, she rose to Kenya's Kakuma to run media in both entertainment and journalism. Today, she joins us from Paris, and she is representing the refugee-run Kakuma news researcher, better known as Welcome to you. Paul Dillon, the acting director of media and communications at the International Organization for Migration. He worked as a journalist for 15 years, covering conflicts, disasters, and political upheaval in Central and Southeast Asia. Paul joined IOM as a media officer following the 2004 Asian tsunami. Some of the earliest attempts were made to systematically investigate and address humanitarian communications gaps against the situation. Joining us from Geneva, Switzerland, welcome to you, Paul. We tried to get Cookie Monster, but we got the next one. Dr. Nina Papadopoulos has for more than 25 years promoting the right education in both stable and effective environment. She is currently the Vice President of International Education with the Workshop, the organization behind Sesame Street, and similarly beloved children's programming around the world. Nina provides technical
All right, we're back. That's live for you, but in this particular case, it is a live webcast. And sometimes we say there's gremlins in studios. So apologies for everyone for those technical delays. We're back now. So let's get back to where we started. Back up a little bit with apologies. We have such strong path. I really want to for everyone. I want to make sure everyone really gets well at. So firstly, we have Young, who was born in Kenya, a refugee. The parents fled what is South Sudan early 90s. As an aspiring fashion model, she rose to Kakuma's refugee-run media, both entered and journal. Today, Iris Frank is representing the refugee Kakuma lecture. Welcome to you. Paul Dillon, acting director of the media communication at the Internet Organization. He has worked as a journalist for years, conflicts and political people in Central and Southeast Asia. Paul joined media office in 2004 NAMI, where some of the early were made to adequately address community gaps, crisis. Joining us from Switzerland. Welcome back. We tried to get but we got the Dr. Nina Papadopoulos worked for more than 25 years promoting the right education of stable and effective environment. She's currently president of International with Seth Workshop, which is the organization similarly beloved programming. Nina provides leadership and implement evaluate early child joining us from welcome to you. And finally, my colleague, Qasim Abdurrahim, joined Voice of America in 2019 as an journalist at Extremism One. He was born of Cash on the Newark Road in Malaysia. Though he now works for China Bread, where he covered mainly on Central Asia. Prior to joining ran a private language for 26 until 17. Until he has used it. Qasim to conceal it. There, Qasim.
Hi, Gary.
Welcome to you, Qasim. And I know we have some not just real experts in our audience. So we'll keep that open. Higher discussion. Please, if you're watching, don't be shy. Look, I want to very soon. Got some news to share for us. But while our technical team gets that worked out, let me turn to you, Nina. As I was mentioning Qasim, we mentioned that he once ran a language school before he had to flee China. I think a lot of people know about Sesame Street as a platform for education, particularly in young children in the US and around the world. But I'm not sure whether people really know specifically about your outreach to crisis-afflicted and displaced children. What's Sesame up to? And maybe more importantly, why?
Great, thanks. Great question. So Sesame Workshop has just recently launched a program that an initiative that we're calling Welcome Sesame. And we're laser focused on looking at both rapid responses and emergencies, as well as addressing the needs of young children in complex emergencies. This work started about 5 years ago, and we received very generous funding from the MacArthur Foundation to respond to the ongoing needs of Syrian children related to the Syrian crisis. And our program, Ahlan Simsim, is a local adaptation of Sesame Street in the Syrian response region. And it's produced in collaboration with local experts. Ahlan Simsim focuses on emotional ABCs with characters and stories children can relate to. And so our approach really changes depending on the context. But what we've learned time and time again is that children experiencing distress and trauma of war and displacement need the same thing. They need nurturing care and meaningful engagement with a loving and caring adult and playful early learning. And most of all, they need to see and hear the language that they speak at home and characters and identities that they can relate to.
Thank you so much, Nina. Billeen, I had the opportunity to visit your home, Kenya's Kakuma refugee camp. When I asked people there about refugee-run media, I kept hearing two names: Kakuma's Got Talent and the Kakuma News Reflector, or Canare. And I understand you've been involved with both of them. Is that right?
So actually, get involved into both of them, and the most Kakuma News Reflectors one is the number one, or is the refugee media, independent media in the world. We are doing a unique job in the camp. The work that not even 8 organizations are doing, being the voice of the refugees. So it's facing a lot of challenges, and we're still trying harder to deliver the refugees' voice. So it's one of the unique and one of the best newspaper, as I can say, as a refugee newspaper. So we are facing a lot of challenges, but we're still working hard to deliver our work as refugees and media news. We're doing this kind of a unique job in the camp that not 8 organizations are doing. Getting the right information, verifying the information, addressing the challenges that not any organization or not anyone in the camp that are doing, trying to be voice of the refugees, which is the most important thing. So one of the biggest challenges we are facing to deliver at what we do is, I think we're trying to fight the free press, and my network is kind of, I don't know.
Understood. Well, very interesting, Billeen. I want to go back to Qasim now, whose video appears to be back. Now, Billeen, you grew up in a refugee camp, but Qasim, you experienced displacement in a different way. So some similarities, some differences, but most of us here at Voice of America, we're journalists, and I think I know news when I hear it. So when I was reading through your introduction, I heard something that sounded like news to me. Up until today, you used a pseudonym, but you're dropping it as of this event. Is that right?
Yes, yes, as you introduced, my name is Qasim Abdurrahim, but I have been using a pseudonym, a pen name, as Asim Kashgarian since I started working at VOA in 2019. The main reason behind that pseudonym, using that pseudonym, is that I was, as many other Uyghurs in diaspora outside China who escaped from China, worry that their relatives or their friends might be harassed or intimidated or even threatened to be imprisoned if their relatives outside of China are engaged in works such as journalism or activism. So I kept my real identity under my behind my pseudonym, but finally I decided that I should my identity should come out as it is, without any fear, because, well, I've had enough so far. There are some reasons behind that. Some of my former employees were arrested last year that I found out later that because the Chinese government found out that I actually work for Voice of America. And I decided that I should come out.
Well, Qasim, whether you're writing as Qasim these days or Awesome until very recently, I'm sure you say your name has to come out, but I know you have news to get out too. To get things going, what are the big messages that Uyghurs need to hear, the news that Uyghurs need to hear once they have fled Xinjiang?
It's mostly about the news that they want to hear is about what's actually happening to the bigger Uyghur community that they have left from in China. So mostly they want to be heard, or like they want to be the voice of their community back in China, because in most cases, up until recently, there has not been a lot of coverage on the situation of Uyghurs, and that's what they want to be heard.
Now, Paul, it took us too long to get to you, but when I think of organizations active in displacement settings, the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, is one of the first that comes to mind. Am I right to think that the basis of IOM's outreach to affected communities is mostly communicating those life-saving messages that might be more urgent and more instructional than some of our other panelists' work with journalism or education?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Gary. No, you're right. We're living in a period of almost unprecedented global displacement. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center's 2021 report, there were close to 60 million internally displaced people around the world. That's slightly less than the population of Italy. And of course, that didn't capture the enormous displacement caused by the war in Ukraine. And this is a core pillar of IOM's operations. We are co-leads on the global camp coordination and camp management cluster with our friends at UNHCR, and are involved at the grassroots level in many camp and camp-like settings around the world. Cox's Bazar, Nigeria, Tigray, Somalia. All of these locations we're deeply involved. On the communications, it is gratifying to see what's happened in the last 15 to 18 years, and how there's been an acknowledgement, I think, of the primacy of communication and active communication and two-way communication between humanitarians and displaced persons. This is built into a process that IOM goes through, a tool called the Displacement Tracking Matrix, which basically maps out humanitarian needs amongst displaced populations, and sourcing out communications needs and channels and those types of things are part of the survey process that goes into informing the DTM reports on a country by country or region by region basis, and informs the broader humanitarian response. The messages are urgent. The messages are operational. The messages are life-saving in some respects, and they're designed to identify pressure points, gaps, and particularly holes in protection services and vulnerabilities of displaced populations, particularly women and young girls and children in those situations.
Thank you so much, Paul. So we have some journalists, educators, and a humanitarian with us, and I'm sure they want to hear your thoughts and your questions as well. The theme is reaching and engaging refugee and displaced communities, and the chat is open for your questions, so please don't be shy. We will take as many questions as we can that are relevant to this discussion. So I think at this point, we now have a pretty good sense of who our panelists are and their backgrounds. So let's get back to it. I'd like to talk a little bit about needs, the needs of those who've experienced displacement, whether they be refugees or have been displaced in some other manner. And I want all of our panelists to feel free to please jump in if you have something to add. But I want to go back to you, Paul. When we were preparing for this session, you were telling me about the response to the 2004 Aceh tsunami and the communication strategy, or maybe the lack thereof.
Yeah, it was. I just literally turned my journalism hat around and started a job within the UN system, and I was struck and deeply impressed by the sophistication and the professionalism of the first responders there, both from the international community and indeed from the Indonesian side. But there was a bit of a showstopper moment at one point when I attended one of these meetings and asked a simple question, which was, what are we doing to reach out to these displaced communities around the province of Aceh to identify what they think are their priorities? how are we staying in touch with them, and how are we addressing their self-identified needs? And crickets, really, it's almost like it hadn't really occurred to them to do so. So we initiated a process, some of the communications officers, to roll out what I think may be one of the first, and I'm sure NGOs and others have done this type of thing in the past, but for the UN system, it was a bit new, to go out and do a communications needs assessment. We trained up truck drivers and our field staff to go out and identify the key opinion formers in communities, their normal, how they would normally consume and receive information, who they trusted, and significantly what they felt they needed to know. Of course, it's much more sophisticated now, and entire systems have grown up. The CDAC network, CWC, and other efforts to professionalize this. But this was very much sort of grassroots efforts in the early days.
Paul, you read my mind. In my notes for later on in this discussion, CDAC and CWC are a couple of the the acronyms that I've heard working in humanitarian sectors, providing journalism to individuals who've been served by humanitarian actors. So I want to get back to that in a little while. But Nina, I think you said you want to do you wanted to get in. Does Paul's assessment sound similar to how Sesame works?
Yeah, assessment is something that I think those of us that have worked in this field for a long time is sort of ingrained in our best practice. And I wanted to add a tiny bit more around specifically the education sector. Sesame Workshop seeks to be responsive to the needs of displaced communities and families, and not just their needs, but the risks associated with our programming and our responses. We put their needs in the driver's seat rather than impose content or programming that we think they need based on our other experiences. And I just want to add and underscore that assessing risk is a growing priority in our field. Education programming has the potential to reproduce existing inequalities and tensions. And so when we design sort of education interventions, particularly in crisis and conflict settings, we really it's really important to prioritize a do no harm principles and really understand how education content and teaching and learning practices can promote more peace and shared identities rather than reproduce those existing tensions and inequalities.
I'm glad you mentioned the term risk, Nina. I've heard many times over the years that refugees themselves are often nervous about criticizing the groups who work in the camps. They're afraid that if they speak out about an injustice, that maybe they will, receive lesser services, or there will be some amount of retribution. So risk, it exists on an individual sense, but also in the organizational sense. Billeen, I want to actually follow with you on that. I'm going to ask you a question in two parts because, because you're still a resident of the Kakuma camp. If you're not comfortable addressing one of the aspects of this question, feel free to ignore it. But I'm curious about how you feel about the communications you receive from outside groups in Kakuma. And I'm also curious about how refugee-run media organizations find their audience.
To answer you, I'm still a refugee, and I should answer you using the Kakuma News Reflectors tree. It's kind of weird that the exercise to free press in the camp is one of the major things. Like, it's one of the issues that refugee medias are facing. We don't have free access we don't have free press. We can't tell what actually is on the ground, which is really, really one of the things that I always ask whenever I'm having a conversation, that is a refugee rights the same to human rights? If yes, they are. And then to why a refugee threatened to exercise the free press? Take an example of the founder of the Kanere, which is Kakuma News Reflector, was arrested 4 times when he founded the Kanere News. And he was arrested because of the free pressing. Secondly, our Kanere editor was arrested covering the teachers' demonstrations which leave me in accords. If indeed refugees' right are to human rights, why are they being threatened in exercising the free press? So it's really not easy in the camp, especially with refugee journalists, which that they really need protection to exercise the free press. The other things are more sensitive, and I don't need to go into detail with them because I am a refugee and how it is. I know I'm a truth-teller, but how it is on the ground is kind of like. But you can take an example of what I've mentioned earlier about the Canary. So engaging refugees and reaching and engaging refugees and displaced people into activities will start with protecting them. Let them have the free press in order to feel comfortable on the ground to get involved or to get engaged into the other activities. So that's how I can answer you, Gary. Back to you.
Thanks, Billeen. I think that's a really interesting point. I think, journalists by nature, we have to have sometimes an adversarial relationship. It's our job to ask difficult questions and find answers, even if sometimes those answers are a little bit inconvenient. But I think we also, sometimes, some of us tend to think of the humanitarian organizations as, I don't know, maybe the good guys, or at least not the bad guys in a lot of these, crisis-affected environments. Yet, despite that, what you just said, I've heard that many times before. That sometimes refugees themselves are nervous about speaking out against those providing services. Paul, how do you see that? Do you ever see do you see the media as an ally or someone who comes in and causes trouble? What is your perspective of the press, whether it's refugee-led press or whether it's domestic press, international press in displacement environments?
Look, I think like anything else, it's a mixed bag. I mean, our greatest allies and articulators can be the media, our champions, and those who also hold us to account. And it has an absolute, the media in all their different permutations and combinations play an absolutely essential role in my books in terms of ensuring that, we are accountable to the people we serve. One of the interesting things over the last 15 or 20 years has been to watch how coverage of humanitarian response or operations, the oversight, has also become professionalized. There are a number of main media outlets that in the 1990s never would have considered having a dedicated unit to covering humanitarian issues, for example. And now in the new humanitarian, there's a standalone and well-regarded platform to do so. My concern is, to a certain extent, lack of capacity, knowledge, and understanding amongst many of the journalists who are out there. And I'll take the migration phenomenon as a perfect example of that. The language of displacement, the differences between the terminologies of refugee, migrant, internally displaced person, what we consider relatively straightforward and simple matters are sometimes very elusive for journalists. And in response to that, the International Organization for Migration a couple of years ago launched its Global Migration Media Academy, which is actually meeting today. And yesterday, a group of 50 or 60 young media professionals in the Canary Islands to discuss exactly how human mobility is framed in the media, to try and deconstruct a little bit the politicization of human mobility, of migration, and the increasing sort of instrumentalization of migrants, the use of migrants and the phenomena of human mobility to achieve political ends. So, as I said, on the one hand, our greatest champions and those who hold us to account, and on the other hand, a lot of gaps in the knowledge in terms of, for those people who are covering these very sensitive sectors.
Qasim, I want to pivot to you because similar to Billeen, you have experience on both sides of this. You've experienced displacement and you've worked in the media. In general, how do you think the media does in displacement settings? Are they helping, hurting, something in between, case by case?
Well, media is. I mean, in my early job, as you mentioned, I was in education, but coming into media and understanding and working, I've personally experienced that it's tremendous that media can do to the displaced communities around the world. Like in my coverages uh, of displaced communities such as Uyghurs and Kazakhs around the world, mostly in Middle East, like Turkey or Egypt or Saudi Arabia. They have, in most cases, those communities have not been heard enough. And when media reaches out to them and hears their voice and spreads their information, it helps a lot. In some cases, even the media saves lives. For example, like in a few months ago, like when the war in Ukraine started, two refugees, one Kazakh and Uyghur refugee, fled the country. But then after they fled to a third country, they were arrested. But we reported, and that day they actually showed the VOA news, and then the border control in one of the Eastern European countries, after they saw the news coverage, they actually released them. So it does a lot of help instead of hurting the displaced communities.
You know, you may have noticed that we called this event Reaching and Engaging Refugee and Displaced Communities. Paul, you touched on this earlier. Legally, the term refugee has a fairly specific meaning. But for this event, we're trying to sort of zoom out and just talk more broadly about media for everyone who has been forced to leave their home, regardless of what label we might want to put on them. And I see an interesting question coming up in the chat from Petra Dillon. Petra wants to know, what's the role of communications to uphold or augment the rights of IDPs in a circumstance of crisis? IDPs, internally displaced persons, someone who has been forced to leave their home but has not crossed an international border. Who wants to weigh in on this? I know Sesame has done some work with internally displaced persons. So has the IOM. Anyone want to jump in on this one?
Sure. I mean, I think that as I said, the acknowledgement of the centrality of communications in IDP situations, in situations of displacement, has changed quite dramatically in the last 15 or 20 years. And you know, in terms of the holding to account, as it were, or ensuring the basic human rights of people in displaced circumstances are upheld. The communications, I mean, this is communications externally, of course, to other actors like journalists or government partners and others, but also internally up the pipe, as it were, between internally displaced people and those who are attempting to provide them services to ensure that their human rights are acknowledged and respected. I mentioned a little earlier, in particular on issues of protection, the communications and the accurate and timely flow of communications from internally displaced populations and those actors who are assisting them is absolutely critical.
And just to add to that, I think it's such a wonderful question, because we think about it at Sesame in terms of access to knowledge is power, and education and learning is a human right. And therefore, we really sort of, with a laser focus, analyze the distribution channels and structures that are available in any given situation or context. And, you know, when we think of media can range from paper to digital to mobile. And so, for example, we're looking for opportunities to not create like who has access and who doesn't have access to the information, and the knowledge and the skills that are being sort of focused on in our programming. And so this an analysis is really important in order for us then to design our interventions with local communities, so that media does not become something that actually creates more distance between different parts of the population that is displaced.
You know, regardless of whether someone is the label applied to them once they've left their home, or whether someone has left their home at all, I think one thing everyone has in common is that they like to see and hear content in their own language. Nina, it seems like Sesame Street, what we call Sesame Street in the US, has been localized into numerous languages around the world. Do you do anything differently when versioning Sesame into a language that has a large group of displaced children? Or is, what I see in the US pretty similar to what I might see in Somalia?
We do things differently, and again, this is really linked to our analysis and our assessments of what the needs are in those particular locations and communities. And for example, our program and our show Ahlan Simsim, which is in the Middle East and responding to the Syrian crisis, in our initial assessments, we found out that social and emotional skill building was the top priority for those communities. So that, in addition to ensuring that we were using the appropriate Arabic language, etc., we really focused our curriculum on social and emotional skills, whereas in other contexts, there might be other learning priorities for our age group, which is between 2 and 8. So really looking at early learning needs for both young children and their caregivers and families.
Qasim, I'm curious your thoughts on the similarities and differences versus between displaced persons and persons who have fled their home but remained in the country, or persons who are still living at home. When you as a Uyghur language journalist are trying to reach fellow Uyghurs, do you take different approaches depending upon the geography of your audience?
Yes, definitely. Well, it depends on where that refugee or displaced a person is, lives or stays when you reach out to them. Depending on the freedom of the geography, the boundaries that they live. For example, when I reach out to asylum seekers in the Americas, like Canada or the US, or in other Western countries, it's more, they can speak of their minds more freely. But then when you reach out to people in parts of the world where they fear for intimidation or threats of repatriation, they actually tend to be silent about their situation, even if that situation is life-threatening. For example, sometimes people get arrested in a third country, and then they might like a situation where they might be repatriated to the original country, but then they like negotiate like whether they want to talk to media or not, like if it helps or if it does not help. And sometimes they choose to be silent, and in some cases people who chose to be silent got actually repatriated. I had a few interviews and we were not able to actually write on them. And then at the end, it was, I heard that those, some of them got repatriated from a third country. So it depends on where that person lives and the freedom that person has in those countries. For example, when I reach out to, there's a largest refugee community of Uyghurs and Kazakhs in Turkey. So when I reach out to them, even if their story is really unique and they are threatened in that country, maybe they might, well, they already got arrested, or they might be repatriated to China. They kind of like stay silent, because even in that country, they fear that they couldn't speak freely. So it depends. And then, well, in the case of IDP, in like when I reach out to people in China, it is even worse. Like I would say the worst. In most cases, if it's really life-threatening, they might try to speak out. If it's not, then they choose to be silent.
Qasim, you mentioned Turkey. I'm not sure if we have it back there in the control room. Voice of America broadcasts in 48 different languages. Uyghur is not one of them, but we did do one really interesting comic book style piece in the Uyghur language. I don't know if we have that, if we can put that on the screen, but if not, you might be able to find it. Oh, there, on its way. But you might be able to find that on voanews.com. Qasim, if I remember correctly, you were involved in translating this piece. And if I remember correctly, this piece, not only did we do it in Uyghur, but I think we actually did it in a couple of different alphabets in the Uyghur language. Language access, obviously very, very important to, regardless of where you may be. There it is. There's the Roman alphabet version of this piece. So language access, not just the languages of the native languages that people may speak at home, but I understand that, many times once people flee, they pick up the local language. Qasim, do you think there's value in reaching out to displaced persons in the language of the country in which they're staying, or should we really try to focus on the native language?
It is. There is a great value in reaching out to the communities in the language, and even in the language that they live in those communities. In the case of this comic style reporting, we did translate the English version into Uyghur, but then we had it versioned in 3 different styles. One is the Arabic-based Uyghur alphabet, and the other one is the Cyrillic, and then the other one is the Latin. But because each around the world, the same group has different. They use different alphabetic systems. For example, in the former Soviet Union Central Asian states, the Uyghurs use the Cyrillic one, and then in the other parts of the world outside of China, they use the Latin based alphabet, and then inside the Uyghur region, they use the Arabic based Uyghur alphabet. So it was important to actually reach out to the same community but different geographical locations, so that we can actually add value to those who are in need of that information.
Great. Turning to the chat, I see we have a comment from John Mabusu. John says, Uganda has a big number of displaced communities from South Sudan and DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, who are hungry for credible information. Is VOA setting up an FM station in a refugee camp in Uganda? While I'm the moderator, I'll try the last part of that. VOA is always looking for new opportunities for FM transmitters. I don't know of anything imminent in Uganda, but not too long ago, we did launch a new FM station serving Bilin's hometown of Kakuma. You specifically mentioned South Sudan, and Bilin is of South Sudanese descent. So I want to ask her, we're talking about language access. Bilin, you're speaking to us from France, South Sudanese, grew up in Kenya, coming to us in France in the English language. When you're looking at media in Kenya's Kakuma camp, what languages do you prefer? Do you prefer, Swahili? Do you prefer English? Do you prefer regional languages? What are your preferences?
Actually, what I prefer is in original languages and more of Swahili, because these are the main languages that refugees in the camp listen better, and when you talk to them, they understand better and they can easily give you what you want.
Well, for that information, for the audiences to hear that information, obviously it has to find the way to their ears. I referenced radio, our listener referenced radio, but I've also found that in displacement settings, there are these rather unique messaging systems, structures for which by which information can flow, particularly that life-saving, urgent information. And I wanted to circle back with you, Paul. You've used a couple of acronyms: CDAC, communicating with disaster-affected communities; CWC, communicating with communities. How do you use these information sharing networks structures to get the word out?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I mean, I'll do my best to avoid the alphabet soup approach moving forward. Look, all of these approaches boil down to one thing, and I think Nina touched on this earlier, which is that the needs and the demands of the populations are assessed properly, and pardon me, and based on that we can build a response, a humanitarian response on the communications side. Study after study shows that the most effective way to communicate with people is face-to-face. Person-to-person, peer-to-peer level communication is the way to go. And that's very much the approach that IOM takes on the humanitarian side through this use of this displacement tracking matrix, where information is collected and disseminated at site, and two-way feedback channels are established between communities and humanitarians who are providing services. But there are, of course, a wide range of different types of approaches one can use. I recall after the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, the humanitarian response on the communication side was to mine the information that was available through the public broadcasters and the public utilities to establish the movements of cell phone carriers around the country, and particularly in the affected areas, and then to script and develop a series of short messages and feedback numbers for people in the countryside, in these ruined areas of Sindapolchak and elsewhere, to be able to feed back information, to ask questions, and this was done on a mass scale. So I think you really have like a sliding scale of responses there, from the individual, empowered person within the community who's mining his or her neighbors for their needs and their desires on the information side, to these much broader initiatives, collecting vast quantities of data and pouring that into a system that's designed to respond again to the needs of the affected populations. As I said, the system has become far more complex than it was back in the early days, when it was simply a matter of passing around a piece of paper and responding as quickly as you could to put up a bulletin board, which to this day remains not a bad approach in some ways to at least getting local newspapers up for people to read on a mass scale. There's as I said, a scale of different types of communications responses in these types of situations.
Yeah, Paul, I think I read a comment from UNHCR Chief Filippo Grandi over the summer. He said if I remember correctly, that if there were one word he would use to describe displacement settings, it would be complexity. And there's certainly a lot of complexity in the information sharing networks as well. Paul, you mentioned you helped us out with terms like CWC and CDAC. These networks, these structures that are well known to humanitarians, but might not be broadly known among journalists or within non-humanitarian circles. Another term that I hear a lot of that I think is probably quite important: host community inclusion. This idea that when we're working with displaced persons, it's important to realize that they're moving into other people's neighborhoods and cities. Host community inclusion. Nina, I see you nodding along. Is that something that's important to Sesame?
Yeah, very important, actually. And I think broadly speaking, it's an important concept and priority across the board, I think, for any humanitarian action. What we've seen over the years are more and more displaced populations, including IDPs and refugees, are integrated into host communities, as opposed to in refugee camps, which is sort of a more traditional, historical configuration. And therefore, really, again, this really links well to the question around risk and the assessment around risk is what are the risks of providing services that are discrete to refugee or displaced populations and ignore the needs of host communities that are then sort of, double burdened in terms of their social services, including health, education, transportation, et cetera. And so really designing and action and interventions that both take into account the needs of host communities as well as the displaced communities so that tensions are not actually increased and divisions are not driven further. And so, for example, I'd love to give an example. Our work, our Ahlan Simpson programming is really meant to cover, it's meant to reach both the displaced communities as well as the host communities through a variety of services that are available in early childhood education, locations with training, et cetera. And so really focusing on both of those communities because they are both facing very important needs during displacement.
Well, we're down to our final 5 minutes. And I mentioned way back at the beginning of the discussion that journalism is our bread and butter here at VOA. It's not all we do, but it's certainly the biggest part of it. And it's probably what we're known best for. And I'll let you know a trade secret. When journalists wrap up an interview, the last question is almost always the same. Anything else? So I want to go around the room one last time for any parting thoughts as we wrap up this discussion on reaching and engaging refugee and displaced communities. Paul, let's go to you.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Look, I'm going to sign off just by trying to tie Nina's really well thought out comments in a bow on this issue of host communities because I think this is a very interesting question. Central element of what we do is to ensure that host communities for displaced populations are part of the solution. And I mean, let's localize this for a moment because sometimes it's very easy to fall into the notion of the other. You're sitting somewhere in the United States or Western Europe and you're talking about something that's happening a long way away. A hurricane slams into southern Florida and millions flee. Now, where do these people go? I mean, they don't all have the resources, the money to check into an Airbnb or a Hojo or a Motel 6 or whatever. A lot of these people are going to end up in the homes of family and friends and people who are just reaching out to help. It's Good Samaritans, if you want to call them that. And you have to extrapolate along a timeline. Imagine those people are still living in your basement in 3 or 4 months' time as a result of the displacement caused by this disaster. And ask yourself if you wouldn't want to have a voice in that recovery and that response. Look, this has been a really interesting conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today on these really pressing matters.
Thank you, Paul. I'm grateful for your time. Finishing, going around for our final thoughts. Billeen, any words of wisdom to leave us with?
Hello, I was a little bit having network issues. You can repeat what you said so that.
So we're just about out of time, but I'm going around the room one final time to hear any parting thoughts from our panelists. Anything you want to say briefly as we wrap up our discussion for today?
Yeah, actually, what I would love to say before we wrap up the panel is that today's topic was so interesting, reaching and engaging refugees. And on media side, I will actually say that to get to reach the refugees is to find the right information on the ground. So what I would say about that is that I think to take an example of Kanere, we are unique and we are doing the unique job in the camp that getting the right information, verifying and being a voice of the refugees, which is more powerful than any other thing. And what I would love to say about that is that it's more of a question that is there any way that we can protect journalists or refugee journalists to have a free press, like say the reality and feel comfortable and confident that they are going to be protected? It's
You know,
direct Voice of America.
Bilin, we almost all of our programs end with this phrase, a free press matters. So I think the safety and security of refugee journalists is something close to the hearts of Voice of America. And thank you for adding that as your final comments. Wrapping it up, it looks like we're going to be about a minute or two over time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I definitely want to hear their closing thoughts from our final two panelists. Nina.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat anything that my colleagues have said, so I want to leave you with a number, 41%. 41% of the 89.3 million forcibly displaced people are children below the age of 18. So any responses and any work in this area that brings together sort of media and rights, we want to make sure that we're looking at the needs of this very vulnerable part of that population, which are children. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And last but certainly not least, Qasim.
Yeah, thank you. Nina actually did point out a great perspective. With numbers, the kids, the children, and I want to say that media giving information to displaced communities by the help of media or through media is really in demand. Really important. And then the second part is the education, what the refugee or displaced communities need, and I have experienced that in my job, reaching out to different displaced communities around the world, and what they need is definitely education and more help for their little children. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Qasim. Qasim Abdurrahim, my colleague from Voice of America. Dr. Nina Papadopoulos of Sesame Workshop. Bilin Manyang, representing the Kakuma News Reflector, better known as Canere, and Paul Dillon of the International Organization for Migration. Thank you all so much. And I say that thank you not only for myself, but also on behalf of the team behind the scenes, and on behalf of all of my Voice of America colleagues from the past 80 years. And then lastly, one final thank you to the team that has been most important to us for almost all of those 80 years. That's you, our audience. I hope this information, the information that you gathered in this session will be useful for you in your work and your efforts to reach and engage refugee and displaced communities. Thank you so much for your time, for bearing with us through those technical challenges at the beginning of the program. I really appreciate it. My name is Gary Butterworth, and I'll say goodbye for now. I'll return to my more familiar home behind the scenes here at VOA. But remember, Voice of America content continues online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Check us out in 48 different languages at voanews.com. Thank you all so much.